The saloon doors of Silver Creek swung open like the gates of hell itself. Jake Iron Steel stepped into the smoky haze, his weathered hands resting easy on the twin Colt 45s at his hips. 45 years of hard living had carved deep lines around his gray eyes, but those eyes still burned with the fire of a man who'd never learned to quit. Three men sat at the corner table. Black hats, black hearts. The kind of vermin that crawled out from under rocks when decent folks went to sleep. "You Jake Steele?" The leader's voice cut through the silence like a rusty blade. Scars crisscrossed his face like a road map of violence. "Depends who's asking. Name's Carson. We hear you got something that don't belong to you. 20 Apache kids. Our boss wants 'em back." Jake's jaw tightened. For 6 months, he'd hidden those children on his ranch. 20 innocent souls, the last survivors of a massacre he should have prevented 15 years ago. The weight of that failure had crushed him every single day since. "Tell your boss he can go to hell." Carson's hand moved toward his gun. So did his partner's. The saloon held its breath. "Wrong answer, Marshal." The word Marshal hit Jake like a physical blow. He hadn't worn that badge in a decade, not since the day he'd watched his commanding officer order the slaughter of innocents. But some titles, like some sins, never wash clean. "I ain't no marshal anymore. Once a lawman, always a lawman. That's what Colonel Morrison says." Morrison. The name tasted like poison in Jake's mouth. His former commanding officer. The man who'd turned the horrors of war into a profitable business. The man who transformed from a decorated Civil War hero into the Southwest's most dangerous criminal. Carson's hand twitched toward his iron. Jake moved. The Colt cleared, leather in a heartbeat. Thunder roared through the saloon. Once, twice, 3 times. Gunsmoke filled the air like morning fog, and when it cleared, 3 men lay sprawled in their own blood. Jake holstered his weapon, but pain shot through his left shoulder. Carson's final shot had found its mark. Blood seeped through his shirt, warm and wet. The ride back to his ranch felt longer than usual. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every ridge could conceal a sniper. Jake had learned caution during the war, fighting under Morrison's command at Antietam. Back then, Morrison had been a hero, a leader men would follow into the gates of hell itself. Now Morrison was something else entirely, something darker. As Jake dismounted, a shadow moved near the barn, then another. His hand found his gun, but a familiar voice stopped him cold. "Easy, Iron. We ain't here to fight you." 2 figures emerged from the darkness. A man and a woman, both Apache, both armed. The man stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. War paint streaked his weathered face, and a tomahawk hung at his belt beside a Winchester rifle. The woman matched her companion's height, her long black hair braided with eagle feathers. Twin Colt Navy revolvers rode low on her hips, and her dark eyes held the cold promise of sudden death. "Black Wolf. Sarah." Jake nodded to each in turn. "Thought you two were dead. Heard the same about you. Marshal?" Black Wolf's voice carried the weight of old pain. "Heard you quit the law after Morrison started his new business. What business is that?" Sarah stepped forward, her hand resting on her gun. "The business of stealing children. Our children." Black Wolf's next words hit Jake like a sledgehammer to the chest. "Morrison ain't just got 200 children like we thought, Jake. We've been tracking his operation for 8 months. He's got over 500 kids locked up across 3 territories. Fort Diablo is just the main hub." Jake's blood turned to ice. 500 children. An industrial operation that dwarfed anything he'd imagined. Morrison hadn't just gone bad after the war. He'd built an empire of human misery. "Those 20 kids in your bunkhouse," Sarah continued, "they escaped from a transport wagon." Morrison was moving 100 children from his Colorado operation to Fort Diablo when they broke free. Only 20 made it out alive. The weight of revelation settled on Jake's shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about rescuing children anymore. This was about dismantling a criminal empire that stretched across half the American frontier. Why come to me? The Army, the Federal Marshal Service. Morrison owns half the territorial officials, Black Wolf said grimly. The other half are too scared to move against him. He's got protection all the way up to Washington. Before Jake could respond, the night exploded into violence. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly fireflies. The thunder of gunfire rolled across the valley. Jake counted at least 15 shooters positioned around his ranch buildings. Morrison hadn't wasted any time sending his wolves. "The children!" Sarah shouted over the gunfire. Jake was already moving, his military training taking over. "Black Wolf, take the barn. Sarah, cover the bunkhouse. I'll handle the main approach." The Apache warriors melted into the shadows like ghosts. Jake bellied down behind a water trough as bullets whined overhead. His shoulder burned from the saloon wound, but adrenaline pushed the pain away. The battle raged for 20 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 15 bodies littered Jake's ranch yard. But among the dead, Jake found something that chilled his soul. A telegram in Carson's pocket. "Steele knows too much. Full liquidation authorized. Bring children to Fort Diablo immediately. WM." "They're not just coming for the children," Jake said, showing the telegram to his allies. "They're coming to kill everyone who knows about Morrison's operation." A familiar voice called out from the darkness beyond the ranch buildings. "Jake! Jake, don't shoot! It's me!" Tommy Sullivan emerged from the shadows, his hands raised but his gun still holstered. Freckled face beneath a shock of red hair. The boy Jake had raised like a son for 3 years. But Tommy wasn't alone. Behind him came 6 more riders, all armed, all watching Jake with the calculating eyes of professional killers. "They got my sister, Jake," Tommy said, his voice breaking. "Morrison's got Mary locked up in Fort Diablo. Said he'd torture her to death if I didn't bring you in alive." Jake's heart sank. Mary Sullivan was 15 years old, sweet and innocent. Jake had taught her to read from his old military manuals. "Tommy, listen to me. Morrison ain't gonna let either of you live, no matter what you do for him." "I know." Tears cut tracks through the dust on the boy's face. "But I can't let him hurt her. She's all the family I got left." The 6 gunmen behind Tommy spread out, surrounding the ranch buildings. Professional positioning. These weren't ordinary bounty hunters. They were Morrison's personal killers. "Your choice, Jake," the lead gunman called out. "Come quiet or we start shooting kids." Jake looked at Black Wolf and Sarah. 3 against 7. Poor odds, but they'd faced worse. "Tommy," Jake said quietly, "which man is the fastest?" The boy's eyes widened as he understood. "The tall one on the left. They call him Lightning Rodriguez." Jake nodded. In one smooth motion, he drew and fired. Lightning Rodriguez lived up to his name for about half a second. Then Jake's bullet took him between the eyes. The ranch yard erupted in gunfire again. But this time, Jake had an advantage. This time, he was angry. Dawn painted the desert sky the color of fresh blood as 4 riders approached Devil's Canyon. Jake rode point, Tommy beside him with his arm in a sling from the previous night's battle. Behind them, Black Wolf and Sarah moved like extensions of their horses, born to the saddle in ways that spoke of generations spent ranging across the vast western lands. The ambush came exactly where Jake expected it, the narrowest part of the canyon, where red stone walls rose like cathedral spires on either side of the trail. 12 shooters this time. Morrison was getting serious. But Jake had been planning for this fight since before dawn. As the first shots rang out, he triggered the dynamite charges Black Wolf had planted during their scouting run. Half the canyon wall came down in a roaring avalanche of stone and dust. crushing 6 of Morrison's men and blocking the retreat route. The remaining shooters found themselves trapped in a killing ground with 4 people who'd learned warfare in a harder school than they'd ever attended. When the gun smoke cleared, Jake counted 12 bodies among the rocks. But the real discovery came when they searched the dead men's gear. "Look at this," Sarah said, holding up a detailed map of Fort Diablo. But this wasn't the fort Jake remembered from his army days. Someone had added extensive underground tunnels connecting the main buildings. "Morrison's been busy," Black Wolf observed grimly. "These tunnels, they go down 3 levels. And look here, they connect to natural caves that run for miles under the desert." Jake studied the map with growing horror. The underground complex was massive. Storage areas, living quarters, what looked like workshops or factories. And in the deepest level, marked with a red X, a notation that made his blood run cold. "Processing Center, 500 capacity." He's not just holding children, Jake realized. He's turning them into something else, breaking them down, rebuilding them as perfect slaves who'll never think to escape. Tommy looked sick. "Mary's been down there for 6 weeks. What if we're too late?" "We're not too late," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. "But we're going to need a different plan." As they rode through the afternoon heat toward Ghost Rock, Jake's mind worked on the tactical problem. A frontal assault on Fort Diablo would be suicide. Morrison had 60 armed men and the advantage of prepared positions, but those tunnels might be the key. If they could get inside the underground complex. That evening, camped in the ruins of Ghost Rock Trading Post, they captured one of Morrison's scouts, a nervous little man who broke under Sarah's interrogation techniques. "The children ain't just being sold as slaves," he babbled. "Morrison's got doctors down there, army doctors who got cashiered for experiments. They're doing things to the kids' minds, making them forget their families, their tribes, their names, creating perfect workers who'll never rebel." Jake felt his stomach turn. "How many has he processed?" "Over 300 in the last 2 years. Ships them out to mining operations in Colorado and California. Nobody recognizes them as Apache anymore. They look and act like white orphans. Perfect cover." The scope of Morrison's operation was even worse than they'd imagined. He wasn't just stealing children. He was erasing their identities, turning them into ghosts of themselves. "Where's the Sullivan girl?" Sarah demanded. "Building C Level 2. Morrison keeps the pretty ones for special treatment before they go to the processing center." Jake's hands tightened into fists. Mary Sullivan was running out of time. "There's something else," the scout continued desperately. "Morrison knows you're coming. He's got the tunnels rigged with explosives. One wrong step and he'll bring the whole complex down on everyone inside." Jake absorbed this information with the cold calculation of a career soldier. Morrison was smart. He'd anticipated an assault and prepared accordingly. But every fortress had weaknesses if you knew where to look. "Tell me about the guard rotations in the tunnels," Jake said. As the scout spilled everything he knew, Jake began to see the outline of a plan. Dangerous, probably suicidal, but it was their only chance. Fort Diablo squatted on the desert floor like a malignant tumor under the star-scattered sky. But Jake's attention focused on a seemingly innocuous rock formation half a mile north of the main complex. According to the captured scout, that was the entrance to the natural cave system that connected to Morrison's underground empire. "Remember," Jake whispered to his companions, "we've got maybe 2 hours before Morrison realizes his scout is missing. After that, he'll probably trigger those explosives and kill everyone underground rather than lose his operation." Black Wolf checked his tomahawk and bow. 2 hours to find 500 children and get them out through tunnels we've never seen before. "When you put it like that, it sounds almost impossible," Tommy said, trying to manage his nerves. "Almost impossible," Sarah agreed. "But not quite." The cave entrance was hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural, but had clearly been arranged to provide concealment. Jake's military engineering training let him spot the camouflage, and within minutes they were inside the tunnel system. The passages were larger than expected, wide enough for horse-drawn carts. Morrison had been using these tunnels to transport children without being seen from the surface. Jake found wheel ruts in the sandy floor and followed them deeper into the earth. What they found in the deepest level of the complex defied belief. Row upon row of children strapped to tables, while white-coated men worked on them with surgical instruments and strange electrical devices. The air reeked of chemicals and something else, the smell of mines being torn apart and rebuilt. "Dear God," Tommy whispered. Jake had seen the aftermath of battles. He'd witnessed the worst that men could do to each other in warfare. But this was different. This was evil in its purest form, the systematic destruction of innocence for profit. Many of the children on the tables were barely conscious, their eyes vacant and staring. But others were still aware, still fighting the process, still salvageable. "Free the conscious ones first," Jake ordered. "We can worry about the others later." But as they moved through the processing center, alarms began to ring throughout the complex. Someone had discovered their presence. "Jake!" Tommy called out. "Over here!" Mary Sullivan lay strapped to a table in a side chamber, electrodes attached to her temples. Her red hair was matted with sweat, but her green eyes still held recognition when she saw her brother. "Tommy," she whispered, "I knew you'd come." Jake cut her restraints while Sarah and Black Wolf worked to free other children. But footsteps echoed in the tunnels outside. Morrison's guards were closing in. "How many ways out of here?" Jake demanded of a half-conscious Apache boy they'd just freed. "Just the way you came in," the boy gasped. "Morrison sealed all the other tunnels yesterday. Said he was expecting trouble." They were trapped. Morrison had turned his own complex into a death trap, and he was about to spring it. Colonel Wade Morrison appeared at the chamber entrance, flanked by a dozen armed men. He wore his old blue uniform with the eagle still gleaming on the shoulders, as if he were still an officer in the United States Army instead of a monster in human form. "Jake Steele," Morrison said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone that had once inspired men to follow him into battle. "I've been waiting 15 years for this moment." "Have you now?" Morrison's smile was cold as winter wind. "You think you're here to rescue children, but you're really here to learn the truth about your family." Jake's blood turned to ice. "What truth?" "Your wife Sarah, your daughter Emma. You think they died in that Apache village 15 years ago because of confused battle orders, random casualties of war." The chamber fell silent except for the distant sound of machinery and the whispered prayers of frightened children. "I killed them, Jake. Deliberately. Put bullets in both their heads before I burned the village around them." The words hit Jake like physical blows. His hands began to shake, but he kept his guns trained on Morrison's chest. "You want to know why? Because you were getting too close to my original operation, starting to ask questions about missing Apache prisoners, children who disappeared from the camps. I needed you broken, distracted, easier to control." "You bastard! I turned you into my perfect weapon, Jake. Every village we destroyed, every family we scattered, you were right there beside me. My faithful second in command, too eaten up with grief to see what was really happening." Morrison gestured to the processing equipment around them. "This facility, the techniques we're perfecting here, they're based on what I learned breaking you 15 years ago. Grief is the perfect tool for reshaping a human mind." Jake's finger tightened on the trigger, but Morrison raised his hand. "Kill me now, and my men trigger the explosives. 500 children die in these tunnels. Your choice, Marshal. Revenge or rescue. The ultimate test." Everything Jake had ever believed about justice and duty came down to this moment. Personal vengeance against the greater good. Tommy made the choice for him. The young man's gun appeared in his hand like magic, and two quick shots took out the guards flanking Morrison. "Get the children out," he shouted. "I'll handle Morrison." But Morrison had one more surprise waiting. His hand found a detonator switch on his belt. "Nobody's getting out. I'd rather see this whole operation destroyed than let you take it away from me." Jake saw Morrison's finger tighten on the switch and knew he had perhaps 2 seconds to act. In that frozen moment, he made his choice. Not revenge, not justice, duty. Jake's shot took Morrison in the wrist, spinning the detonator away before he could trigger it. Sarah's follow-up shot put the colonel down permanently. "The explosives!" Black Wolf called out. "How do we disarm them?" Jake grabbed Morrison's coat, pulling the dying man close. "Where are the charges? How do we shut them down?" Morrison coughed blood but managed to smile. "You can't. Timer's already running. 10 minutes until this whole mountain comes down. 10 minutes to evacuate 500 children through tunnels they barely knew. Impossible odds, even for Jake Steele. Unless... The main tunnel," Jake said. "It's wide enough for horses. Black Wolf, get topside and bring down every horse from the fort stables. Sarah, start moving the children who can walk. Tommy, you and Mary organize the ones who need help." "What about you?" Sarah asked. Jake looked at the rows of children still strapped to processing tables. Many of them were unconscious, unable to walk, let alone run for their lives. "I'm staying until the last child is out." "Jake, that's an order, Sarah. Move." The next 8 minutes were the longest of Jake's life. Trip after trip through tunnels filling with smoke as the timer counted down. Children clinging to his back. His arms, any handhold they could find as he carried them towards safety. With 30 seconds left on Morrison's timer, Jake emerged from the caves carrying the last child, an Apache girl no more than 6 years old who reminded him painfully of his lost daughter Emma. The mountain came down behind them in a roar of stone and fire that could be heard for 20 miles. When the dust settled, Morrison's underground empire was nothing but rubble and bitter memories. 6 months later, Jake Steele stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., his weathered hands holding a written report detailing Morrison's criminal empire. The hearing had lasted 3 days, and heads were rolling all the way up to territorial level. "Marshal Steele," the committee chairman said, "your actions have exposed corruption in our territorial administration that goes back 15 years. As a result of your investigation, 17 officials have been arrested, and the entire Apache Affairs Office is being reorganized." Jake nodded. Justice moved slowly, but it moved. "We're prepared to offer you the position of federal marshal for the entire New Mexico territory, with full authority to continue this investigation and ensure it never happens again." Jake considered the offer. A return to federal law enforcement meant leaving his ranch, leaving the quiet life he'd built. But it also meant ensuring that no other children would suffer as Morrison's victims had suffered. "I accept," he said, "on one condition, which is, I choose my own deputies, and they include Apache law enforcement officers with full federal authority on tribal lands." The committee members looked uncomfortable, but they were in no position to refuse Jake's demands. He'd become a national hero, the man who'd broken up the largest child trafficking ring in American history. "Agreed." Jake walked out of the Capitol building wearing a new badge, Federal Marshal for New Mexico Territory, but more importantly, he walked out with the authority to prevent future atrocities. Black Wolf and Sarah were waiting for him on the Capitol steps, both wearing Deputy Marshal badges of their own. In the distance, Tommy Sullivan supervised a group of Apache children boarding a train back to New Mexico. They were going home at last. "Ready to get back to work, Marshal?" Sarah asked. Jake looked out over the city, thinking of all the other children who might be suffering in similar operations across the frontier. Morrison had been the biggest, but he probably wasn't the only one. "More than ready," Jake said. "We've got a territory to clean up." The train pulled out of Union Station carrying them west, toward the setting sun and the work that waited. Jake Steele had found his redemption at last. not in forgetting the past, but in ensuring it could never happen again. Behind them, the Capitol dome gleamed in the afternoon light, a symbol of justice that Jake Steele had helped make real.